This video will cover how you can get this incredible Starlined Samurai build. The Starlined Sword has an incredibly cool moveset that makes you fast and deadly. This video will also cover any spells, talismans, and armor sets you might need for this build, while also covering tips and tricks to get the most out of this build. And most importantly, we'll cover how you can upgrade this build as you progress the game, going from beginner to mid to end game, then finally to the DLC build. So the Moonveil has always been a great early to mid game weapon, mainly because it's strong and it's relatively easy to actually get the weapon. This build takes full advantage of Transient Moonlight, the Moonveil's unique weapon skill. When you hold down your weapon skill, you'll enter this stance. Now, you'll be able to press your light or heavy attacks to send these slicing waves either horizontally or vertically. These attacks have incredible stagger potential, allowing you to break enemy poise and set up for those juicy critical strikes. So how can we make this build even stronger? Well, you can use the Carrion Filigreed Crest, which will reduce the FP cost of your skill by 25%. When you're spamming Transient Moonlight, every bit of FP save counts. It's the difference between getting off that final stagger-inducing hit and running dry at the worst possible moment. The Green Turtle Talisman is important early game, since you're going to be burning through stamina like there's no tomorrow. Now moving on to a mid to end game version of this build before we talk about the DLC build. For this level 100 build, we just have a few things that will change. First, we're going to grab an Uchigatana and put Frost on it. This way, we can dual wield both the Moonveil and the Frost Uchigatana and be able to proc Frost on enemies. This is great for a mid-game build, since some bosses or enemies would be resistant to magic damage, like Renala for example, so being able to proc Frost is useful. When Frost procs, it not only deals a chunk of damage, but also reduces the enemy's stamina recovery and damage absorption by 20% for 30 seconds. This debuff is especially useful against bosses who seem to have infinite stamina sometimes. Or like I said, magic-resistant enemies where your weapon might deal less damage overall. The beauty of Frost is that it doesn't rely on any specific stat scaling, making it a flexible choice for a lot of builds. Additionally, both the Moonveil and the Starlined Sword don't really benefit from being two-handed. It doesn't really get that 1.5 times scaling on strength, so having two swords instead of one will mean you'll be able to proc bleed, frost, and deal damage twice as fast. Also grab the Magic Scorpion Charm. It will increase any magic damage you deal by 12%, which is great for buffing Transient Moonlight's damage. You can use this talisman with the Starlined Sword from the DLC build too. The Ronin set isn't the strongest armor in the world, mostly just for fashion, so you might want to use something like the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman to reduce physical damage taken by 20%, and the Bull Goat's Talisman to raise your poise by 33%. If you're much later in the game, you can also use Alexander's Shard to boost the damage of your weapon skill by 15%. The Moonveil also sets bleeding as a status effect build-up, which is also pretty great, especially if you're also using a Mimic, which means you'll be able to proc bleed fast, which is especially effective against bosses who might be resistant to magic. Now, let's move on to our DLC Magic Samurai build. The Starlined Sword is a unique katana that you can obtain pretty early in the DLC, and just like the Moonveil, it deals double damage, dealing both physical and magic damage. This split damage can be a double-edged sword. The Starlined Sword can be really strong against enemies with low magic resistance, and sometimes weak against those with high magic resistance, like Relana, for instance. But this is exactly why we're still sticking to the Frost Uchigatana on the offhand. Just to remind you, Frost procs will deal a lot of damage, reduce enemy stamina, and damage absorption for 30 seconds. What's really cool is the Starlined Sword's weapon skill, Onz's Line of Stars. This skill is a combination of multiple chain attacks that are based on how many times you press the follow-up button. The follow-ups to the weapon skill are multiple spinning attacks with a very wide range. There's also this somersault attack that almost always catches enemies off balance. Also, this entire combo manages to stun lock most enemies. By chaining the attacks, you can keep them off balance and potentially take them down without giving them a chance to fight back. It's also excellent for cleaving through groups of enemies due to its extended reach, allowing you to control crowds effectively. The Shard of Alexander is a must-have for this build. It significantly boosts the damage of Onz's Line of Stars, making your weapon skill even more devastating. You can also use either Millicent's Prosthesis or the Rotten-Winged Sword Insignia. These increase your damage with rapid strikes, which can be particularly effective if you're able to get in long combos with Onz's line of stars. The damage boost can become quite significant, especially if you're aggressive and can maintain spamming the weapons skill. Now, unlike the Moonveil, and despite having high intelligence requirements, the Starlined Sword doesn't scale that well with int. The weapon actually scales well on dexterity, which means you should focus on pumping that up for maximum damage output. The dexterity scaling far outweighs the others, making it the primary stat for increasing your damage potential. It's also worth noting that the Starlined Sword also retains the blood loss buildup typical of katanas, just like the Moonveil. While this isn't the main focus of the weapon, it can be a nice bonus against enemies vulnerable to bleed, especially if you're using the Mimic tier like I am here. You'll find yourself proccing bleed occasionally, giving you a nice burst of extra damage. Finally, remember that the weapon skill is quite FP intensive. A full combo of Onz's line of stars costs about 26 FP, which can quickly drain your FP bar if you're not careful. Managing your FP becomes an important part of using this weapon effectively, balancing between regular attacks and judicious use of the weapon skill. I have 55 on Vigor in order to have enough health to eat some hits. The Starlined Sword's shorter reach means you're going to be trading hits quite often, so you need to make sure you have enough HP to tank and survive. Mine is at 26. This might seem relatively low, especially given how FP intensive Onzi's line of stars can be. But I found this to be a sweet spot that allows for frequent use of the weapon skill without sacrificing too much in other areas. If you find yourself constantly running out of FP, don't hesitate to pump a few more points here. Endurance is comfortably at 30. This provides a good balance of stamina and equipment load, allowing you to wear decent armor while still having enough stamina for your attacks, blocks, and dodges. Strength is set at the minimum requirement of 12. The Starlined Sword doesn't scale well with strength, so we're just going to leave it at that. Dexterity is our main scaling stat. We're going to have it at 70 to 80 if possible. As you continue to level up, strongly consider pushing this all the way to 80 to squeeze out every bit of damage from your weapon. 80 is a pretty good cap, especially if you're also using Millicent's Prosthesis like I am, which will give you an additional 5 levels into Dex. Intelligence is set to 21, just enough to meet the Starlined Sword's requirements. Despite the weapon dealing some magic damage, it doesn't scale well enough with intelligence to justify putting more points here. Those points are much better spent elsewhere. Faith and Arcane are best left at their base levels. This build doesn't require any of these two stats, so there's no reason to increase them unless you're planning to use specific spells or incantations alongside this build. Here's a video that covers 5 more DLC bleed builds that you can get within 5 minutes of starting the DLC. The Backhand Blades, the Milady, the Great Katana, the Chicken Wing, and a 5th bonus bleed build featuring an OP-based game weapon. I'll see you guys there.